the name of the one and only, we are beginning the second segment of our discussion about the analysis of the life of Prophet Muhammad. In the previous segment, we talked about his life in the earlier period, but primarily in regards to the celebration of his birthday, with which this program coincides. We talked about the procedure in terms of understanding historical accounts, primarily as a disclaimer as to the earlier sources, that how they should be understood and taken with a grain of salt because of the general attempt of writing historical narratives with a whole lot of exaggeration, mythifying and mystifying concepts and events. And we also talked about the early life of the Prophet only as a child, from that particular angle that he was somehow denied a childhood by the hand of destiny, when almost anyone he relied on in his early life somehow left him. His father dying before his birth, his mother dying afterwards, his grandfather and uncle and everyone else. And we didn't talk about the historical events as to how the people of Mecca loved him for who he was, but then in time they turned against him. And that is the segment that we are going to discuss today. Muhammad, before he becomes a prophet, was an activist, a social activist in terms of, as I said, that he spent a lot of his early life in solitude, and that solitude allowed him to have a better insight into the world around him. It allowed him to think and understand and analyze and come up with solutions. As a social reformer and a social activist in his pre-prophetic life, Muhammad was a champion of a number of causes, primarily civil rights, and these could be specified in terms of him being an advocate for three things. One, we could safely say that Muhammad was a feminist, a pioneer feminist, the earliest one we could pinpoint. And at the same time, he was an abolitionist. He wanted to abolish slavery. And then you could also say that he was a social reformer in the sense that he wanted to eliminate or reduce economic stratification of the society in terms of the haves and the have-nots. These three advocacies of Muhammad have changed modern history. The campaign against slavery in the West, primarily in the United States and of course in Europe too, is often portrayed as a modern thinking, a thinking of modern times, whereas the Prophet advocated the same 1400 years earlier, or at least 1200 years earlier if we use 19th century as the time for abolitionist movement in America. The elimination of the or reduction in the economic stratification of society that became part and parcel of European thought with the rise of communism and socialism could be seen as an afterthought, because it was profit who pointed to the wealth and the richness and the manipulation of the status as well as of the position of Mecca in the midst of the Arab society. By Arab I mean the Arabian Peninsula, and also as the township as a resting point between Yemen and Damascus. And though we cannot clearly say that the Prophet was either a communist or a socialist, because he did respect the right, the ownership of property by an individual. And yes, he was a merchant and a businessman in that capacity too. And nonetheless, that does not preclude the fact that his major criticism of the Arabian society, especially of Mecca, was that of the haves and the have-nots. So simply on the terms of the variance between, or the space, the distance between the haves and the have-nots that haunted European society in the 19th century, who came up with the solution of launching the Communist Manifesto and Marxism and the rest of it, which for us is history in both senses, as passé, as well as passé in terms of how we have reached a point of understanding whether that was a solution or not, but also in terms of the chronological order. That's a passé. And now I think in modern day America, in the 21st century in the United States, the void between the haves and have-nots, between the 1% and the 99%, and the movements we had in the last 5 or 6 years, that people took to the streets, the Occupy movement, for instance. These would fall in principle, not in procedure and in how to implement, but in principle. These are attempts to reduce or eliminate the gap between the haves and the have-nots, between the 1% and the 99%, between the extreme poverty and the extreme wealth or material wealth. And so I'm sure that the Prophet would have advocated both and championed these causes with the circumstances of its reality in its own time, and with the proviso that that the emphasis still has to be on the production rather than on the distribution. In modern times, the emphasis of communism and socialism, specifically of communism, is that on a distributive justice, distributive economic justice, whereas modern capitalism champions the productive side of it, and both of them have their flaws. Neither has the economic distributive justice of communism served the cause of the humanity at large, or of the society that came under its rule, nor has capitalism in its productive sense served the cause of humanity in general, because the exploitative, the manipulative, and the extractive, and the emphasis on the profit as the bottom line has not served any society, and the unhappiness in most of Western capitalist societies is because of that. That while in terms of the per capita, the GDP, the general growth, the wealth of a state, and by state I mean both economic as well as the political state, is tremendous. The irony is that in most of these countries, a huge number of the populace live below the poverty line, and that is not social justice, and that is not economic justice. To sum it up, my emphasis here is not to attribute any of these modern manifestations of the eliminations of the economic classes to anything that the Prophet advocated, but rather the principle that social justice has to be at its core also economic justice. And the justice here could be interpreted as fairness, as egalitarian, if not proletarian. So by advocating that, the rich were too rich in Mecca, and that the poor were too poor, the Prophet, obviously who was not a prophet at the time, Muhammad, at that time offended the status quo. He offended the social political order. The second campaign he had was against slavery. Now, not being in charge of the society in terms of its political structure, not being the chief of some sort of a tribal confederation, not being the head of a state, the only thing he could do at the time was to advocate the equality of humans regardless of their color or creed or race or religion. And what he could do, which he did along with his close friend Abu Bakr, was to try to buy as many slaves as they could and set them free. And the prominent ones such as Bilal, the Abyssinian, joined his campaign. Now I'm using the word campaign deliberately because that was a social campaign. So when you look at that side of the aspect of the Prophet's life and his character, he was way ahead of his time by centuries, because these injustices would not affect the conscience of modern Europe, for instance, until much, much later. But I think his most important campaign was that of feminism. The part that most of Muslim historians and Muslim believers advocate is that, yes, the Arabs of the time, in their chauvinistic, misogynistic, patriarchal excesses, found women as a source of shame, and therefore the solution was to eliminate them as much as they could and as early as they could, including in times of their right after their birth, when they were infants. So the live burial of infant girls that had become a customary thing among the Arabs, at least in Mecca, is what shook the Prophet. and in it he saw the inhumanity of a certain phenomenon that had become a tradition. So he fought against this. This, of course, is often where most people stop the Prophet's advocacy for the elimination of to end the live burial of infant girls. But I think he, in his real life, went way beyond that. But in my opinion, the reason that most Muslims stop there is a kind of a cop-out, saying, look, at the time of the Prophet, the Arabs were burying their girl infants alive, and that was bad, and the Prophet stopped it, and that's the end of that. No more. If we stop there, then we certainly cannot call Muhammad as the feminist, the first feminist. But what would qualify that attribute to call him as the first feminist is to see how he changed things in the course of time, before his prophecy and during his prophecy. That is where he allowed, for instance, in view of a revelation that disallowed a kind of a default divorce for the Arabs, which was called, I think, khula, which was if a man was not happy with his wife, he would not divorce her because that was a source of shame. And so for the sake of the social stigma, he will keep the wife, the woman in his household. However, he would announce to her that she is his mother. In other words, that he will not have intimate relationship with her. And so in this way, the woman will be deprived of any opportunity to start a new life outside of this marriage after a divorce, because it was the man's honor not to be considered a divorcee. So the woman had to pay the price. The woman had to sacrifice her life to stay in the household for as long as the man wanted, and yet not have the privilege of being considered a wife, of having intimacy, and having love relationship, and having a family relationship with the man she had married. This was categorically denied and rejected by the Quran, that divorce was allowed. And on the basis of that, then, it implies that a woman could initiate a divorce, which was way ahead of his time, ahead of the time of the Prophet, and way ahead of the time during which this revelation came down, that women gained the right to initiate a divorce proceedings against her husband if she was not happy in the relationship. In the patriarchal order, in the predominant patriarchal order in the world at that time, this was revolutionary by any standard. Then comes the question that if this was his advocacy, some raised the issue of his, for lack of a better term, his polygamous lifestyle, to be more a denial what of any claim to attribute feminism to Muhammad. The reason that this is not understood correctly is as follows: that the institution of marriage has changed over the course of time, over the course of human history. The concept of marriage for Arabs was, at the time, and perhaps for other societies as well, was very different than that which we understand in our modern times. In those times, marriage was done primarily for economic expediency, for as a means of economic survival in a competitive world, where a man and a woman contributed to the family structure through their skills and abilities to produce, to share, to participate and partake. That was one. But in the Arab society, there was another need for that kind of marriage. And that was any woman who was not married was, to put it bluntly, a fair game for the patriarchal order. She had no protection. If she had no guardian and no defender of her rights. And therefore, any woman, particularly a widow, would be targeted for abuse by the society. And because of that, if a woman was dishonored, in essence, that whole clan or tribe was also dishonored, and this will become a source of feuds, intertribal feuds, that could result in the murder and killing of large numbers of people. And so in order to prevent such a trauma, such a chaos, to prevent that sort of a catastrophic level of social disorder, then people made sure that the women amongst them, especially the widows, had to be protected. And they could not be protected unless they were members of the family. And that's where the question of polygamy as the norm comes into play. That people had to marry their widows to give them protection. That was a thing they could fall back on. Now, from a modern perspective, of course, that is, we would think of that as ridiculous, and yes, it would be, except that you have to imagine that at the time there were no police forces to protect every member of the society. At that time, the rulers were primarily interested in collecting taxes, but not necessarily in providing services. So a lot of the services that we receive in modern societies, whether it's hospitals or clinics, whether it's things for social welfare and all that, these were unheard of. They did not exist. So therefore, a particular state, they didn't have nation states, but tribal states or imperial states, were primarily a kind of structures in which the flow, primarily of the money and taxes, was a one-way street. That the rulers, as kings, sheikhs, emperors, had subjects, and only subjects, no citizens. Subjects, by the very definition, mean people who are subjected to certain rules. And when you're a subject, you do not have a right. The issue of rights and responsibilities came up much later in the evolution of the state systems. But in the earlier systems, the rulers had all the rights, all the privileges, and no responsibility toward their subjects. The subjects were subjected to the rule of the emperor. Again, we often address this issue from a point of view of, from a presumption that in that social political order there were rights and responsibilities. Such did not exist. The kings had no duty to address the needs of the society, because society or citizens did not exist with that definition. They were only subjects. And therefore, in the absence of any social network, in the absence of any support system, the weak, the elderly, and the children were subject to a much greater degree of abuse. Children could be kidnapped and sold as slaves, and they were, including the one child that the Prophet bought and adopted as his own son. Zayd bin Haritha was a slave. Grown-ups could be enslaved if they didn't have a social network to support them. We had that example in the life of Salman Farsi, Salman the Persian, who, because he did not belong to any tribe in Arabia, he did not have a tribal support system to defend him. He became a slave. And of course, of Bilal the Abyssinian is another case. So therefore, the social system was basically a free-for-all. Those who had more powers could abuse their power to any degree they wanted to. And because of the lack of stability at the family level, at the grassroots level, the network that would be a family structure was in a way a place for refuge for people who had become needy. If a woman became a widow and did not have any other support system, she had to get married to get support from the new husband. And yes, she would live with the co-wives, 1, 2, 3, or more. But those were the circumstances. We cannot impose the standards of the 21st century upon the 6th century and judge it according to the norms we are used to, without understanding the reality of that time. And so, what the Prophet did for this help was, yes, as I said earlier, he freed slaves, child slaves, in this case Zayd bin Haritha, who was a child, and he bought the slave and adopted that slave as his own son. And since I mentioned the question of adoption, the adoption in Islam is very important in the sense that, in the way that it differs from the West, is that in the Western adoption system, you buy someone, and because you have bought them, and I'm talking about the adoption fees, because you buy the person, you deny the person his or her identity. They have to have your name, your last name. They have to become yours, because their economic deprivation does not give them the strength to defend who they are. Whereas Islamically speaking, that is not so. Muhammad adopted Zayd, but Zayd was also always called Zayd bin Harisa. What his name was never changed. His last name or his father's name was always there. His identity was kept intact. He was not coerced into anything, including his faith and belief system, to a point that the reciprocity in this mutual friendship that evolved between Muhammad and Zayd was such that when eventually Zayd's parents finally tracked him down and found out where their son had been taken, kidnapped, enslaved, and all that, when they came to take him back home, Zayd chose to stay with Muhammad instead of going with his natural parents. So the next step that we can talk about is, as I said, the Prophet married a very rich woman, and she had a lot of wealth. She was probably the richest woman in Mecca. And he spent all her wealth in this manner, in helping social causes and in freeing slaves. It got to a point that by the time he had to emigrate to Medina, he was just a poor man as anyone else, instead of being the rich, wealthy husband of Khadija in Mecca. Now we'll go to the question of the institution of marriage that I talked about earlier. Is that, yes, the Prophet married, but there were only 2 marriages that were done as marriages out of love. All other marriages were out of convenience or social necessity, or the protection of the defenseless. They were not marriages out of lust or romance. There were certain norms to be followed. For example, when the Bishop of Alexandria sent the Prophet a gift, and the gift was a woman, Maria, the Coptic. And this was a norm that rulers of different states, among other things, among exchanging other gifts, also sent humans as their gifts. Slaves, and yes, women slaves, concubines, so to say. And when the Bishop of Alexandria sent Maria, the Prophet said, I could not accept her as a slave, because that will not be giving her, respecting her dignity as a human. And so the only condition would be that she would have to become his equal in a marriage partnership. So he married her. He didn't keep her as a slave. He married her as a wife, because as a wife, she would have equal rights as him who would be the husband. But as a slave, of course, it will be a totally different matter. He married, for instance, Hafsa, the daughter of Caliph Omar, who was married for a particular reason. The woman was perhaps a bit homely and was rejected by the person to whom she was engaged. And this devastated Omar. Not to mention the fact that Hafsa herself would have been stigmatized for life, that no man would have wanted to marry her because she was refused. And so, because he wanted to avoid that crisis, he proposed marriage to the same woman who was rejected by her fiancé. Take Salma, for instance. She was at least 30 years his senior, if not 30, pretty close to a senior citizen, and whose husband died in one of these wars that the Quraysh imposed on the Muslims. And when she became a widow, he proposed to her, and she became also the mother of the believers, as the title would suggest, al-Mu'mineen. Again, that woman was so senior, and the respect for age was such that anytime the Prophet walked with her, he would walk after her. Not in the sense of ladies first, but in the sense that she was always called Mother, Salma. She was the one who diffused the crisis in Hudaybiyah. When the Prophet went on his first quote-unquote attempted pilgrimage, and the Quraysh threatened him with a war, and finally settled to make peace, and the Prophet accepted, and his followers said, we had come 250 miles from Yathrib, from Medina, and you simply take their word for peace, and you want to go back? They were disheartened. And the Prophet was perhaps in a state of confusion, not knowing which side to follow, because half of the Muslims said, we accept the terms of peace and we go back, and others said, no, we have to march on to Mecca and do our pilgrimage. And in a moment of such indecisiveness, if we can take the liberty of defining it as such, it was this woman, Salma, who took the initiative and told Muhammad, she said, Muhammad, I'm going to do my tawaf right here. You want to sit there or you want to follow? And the Prophet followed in the footsteps of Salma, who did a symbolic tawaf and a sacrifice of the animals they had brought, and then went back to Medina. So when you look at these instances, the marriages that Muhammad had were very different than the way they are described. But we have to understand that at the time, and for centuries after, marriages or polygamy was a norm, not an exception, including in Europe, where where monogamy was not instituted because of any religious etiquettes, but rather because of an agreement and a vow between Theodora, the daughter of the stable master of Emperor Justine, who fell in love with her. And here was the emperor who was ready to marry a girl way below his class, his social class, his status. And Theodora, the smart woman, realized that if the emperor is willing to marry the daughter of his stable master, his animal keeper, then his love must be that strong. So the condition that she proposed, Theodora, to Emperor Justine was that I can marry you only on one condition: that you marry me and you marry only me, and no other wife should be taken by the emperor. And that this becomes not just the norm in the palace, but the norm in the entire empire. And that's how monogamy was institutionalized in Europe. It has nothing to do with Christianity, Islam, or any other faith. The norm was polygamy. What the Prophet did was to accommodate under those circumstances. Later, when he became the head of state, that became even more so a necessity of the circumstance, that the weak and the destitute had to be protected. So to sum up his marriage life, there is only one woman who married Muhammad out of love, and that will be Khadija. And she is the mother of his 4 daughters. And there is only one woman that Muhammad married out of love himself. So one in one, the woman loved the man. In the second one, the man fell in love with the woman. And so the woman that Muhammad married out of love would be Aisha. And all the other marriages were out of a social necessity, that because such circumstances do not exist in our time, it's difficult for us to understand. And so once you look at these concepts, you would understand why Muhammad will be considered as the first feminist. But I think the thrust of my argument, if I had to encapsulate the strengths of Muhammad as a person, would be the difference between what we would call, let me put it this way, Muhammad's 3 favorite things. And the 3 things that he loved the most, as it's often reported, is perfume, prayers, and women. Again, if we interpret these literally, that doesn't really make him much of a great man that we ought to respect in historical context, unless we understand what was meant by these 3. I would interpret perfume as manners, morals, ethics, and etiquette. Perfume beautifies a space around a person. When the molecules impregnated with a sweet smell brings that joy and happiness to that environment. And yes, the Prophet had the habit of always going to the mosque with his favorite perfume, which was rose water. The important thing is that here it's the symbolism of perfume that matters. And so he would bring with his personality, with his presence, joy and happiness to a gathering. and giving a smile was not only considered the best charity from his perspective, but also it was his tradition and his habit. The other thing that he liked the most was prayer. And again, this word is, in my humble opinion, misunderstood. Salat is not so much the prayers of the rites and rituals that we do 5 times a day. Those are rituals. What the Prophet liked in Salat was God consciousness. Salat, etymologically, means connecting or reconnecting, bridging the gap between the human and the divine, and having a consciousness expansive enough that one is aware of his or her place, not in a household, in a school or an institution, not in a city or a town or a country, but way beyond that. When one is aware of his or her place in the cosmic reality, when one realizes how small we are, where we are, and the where has to be defined clearly. The where has to include as much as we can and as much as our human perception allows. The where is the totality of the cosmos, of the cosmic reality. And so long as you're aware of that, both in terms of your responsibility to your environment, immediate or beyond, but also in terms of what responsibility is that you're tasked with. It's in that sense that this consciousness allows you to feel connected. And this connectedness with the cosmic totality defines your true being. In that connectedness, you are no longer isolated. You are no longer just you. You're a part and particle and parcel of a much greater reality. And if your sense of awareness is big enough to include all that, then you are aware and awake. Otherwise, you're asleep. And the third element that the Prophet admired and liked most was women. And for a patriarchal society, for a misogynistic society, that means only one thing, that perhaps I, with all apologies due, that would define the Prophet as a womanizer. But if you interpret that correctly, what the Prophet liked was not women as a gender distinction, not women as female, but women as a feminine spirit. Because in the feminine spirit, whether that is part of a male gendered being or a female gendered being, in that feminist spirit, you're a totally different being. We generally define masculine versus feminine. We define masculine as being strong, physical, powerful, and by extension then very violent, very destructive. That's what defines masculinity. But feminine is nurturing. Feminine is mothering. Feminine is life-giving. And therefore, when the Prophet said, I like women, he means I like that spirit of femininity, of nurturing, of birthing, of taking care, of soothing one's feeling when they are hurt. And so that's why if we look at his whole life, and when you look at his relationship, for instance, when he challenges his wife Aisha to race, to run, that would be unheard of in most Muslim societies today, 1400 years later. But then he treated women with dignity, with respect, and with love, and with care. And that's why he deserves to be considered the first feminist. Yes, in a masculine body, but that's a different thing. And the strength of that, if we can conclude, is that often people would cite 1,000 sayings of the Prophet, 1,000 hadiths, but they will not do one single sunnah. The sunnah is the way of his life. Most Muslims today are interested in what he had said or what is attributed to him as his saying. Too few people pay attention to what he did. And that's the difference between the sunnah and the hadith. And from my understanding, part of the Sharia is reliance on the sunnah, Ahl Sunnah, not on the hadith. Because the hadith could be questionable. And what Muslims do often is that they become, like I said, they would recite 1,000 hadith, this is what the Prophet said, but they will not do a single thing what the Prophet did to choose him as his role model. And his other sunnah that I think is often neglected is one that we could say that the Prophet was the founder of the concept of interfaith conference, what is referred to as the Ashab-e-Sufa, where the Prophet will get together with peoples of other belief systems and will have debate and discussion on the model of, let's say, the Greek academy. This was not for conversion. This was not to convince them that his belief was better than theirs. Because in matters of faith, the Quran says there ought not to be any coercion. And he, as the Prophet who brought to the rest of us that revelation, could not have violated that which God had revealed to him. But these were, in the context of the Ashab-e-Sufa, the gathering of the patio was an interfaith dialogue that he participated in. And in my opinion, the reason Muslims in the 20th and 21st century lag behind is because we have forgotten the major sunnahs. One, the sunnah of an interfaith dialogue with the world community. Instead, they want to kill and convert everyone into Islam, and I don't know where that comes from. Obviously from one of the hadith. And the other is that Muslims have forgotten to appreciate the feminine spirit, to honor the dignity of their women. And because of that, Muslims are stereotyped, and correctly so, as misogynistic, patriarchal, and people who really belong to draconian times. So if we had learned anything from the commemoration of the life of the Prophet, is to see anyone you see, to challenge them on these two sunnahs of the Prophet. One is to honor the women, to honor and respect the woman, and to honor and respect the feminine spirit in men and in women. And two, to advocate an interfaith dialogue with all faith communities. And with that, I leave you until the next program of the Indigo Firmament. Have a nice day.